And I think you'll be getting signals here. Yeah.
Hi, so, no, this is the type of material culture. So, this summer, as most of you are already aware, I will be doing ethnographic fieldwork with people who use recreational drugs, especially MDMA, which is also known as ecstasy or Molly, at raves and electronic music events. I became interested in this project as a medical anthropologist, and from my experiences working in outreach teams for homeless and underhoused addicts in BC. Talking with harm reduction educators here in Ontario, I learned that MDMA and the drugs that are being passed off as MDMA at raves are causing increasing numbers of hospitalizations and deaths. So I wanted to find out what people within rave communities are doing or not doing to mitigate these risks in order to help improve harm reduction initiatives, as has become a standard type of research that medical anthropologists are involved in. However, when it comes to recreational as opposed to addictive drugs, these things are not mutually exclusive categories by any means. The more I read and read both published studies and personal accounts online and talk to people, I've begun to feel increasingly uncomfortable with the idea of seeing the concerns of drug users through a strictly medical lens. Yes, harm reduction is extremely important, especially for users of drugs involved in disease transmission, but is it the main concern of the particular group of users that I'm going to be researching? In most ethnographic studies, it's considered pretty damn presumptuous to go into a population, tell them what they need, and when asking for their opinions, just ask them, why are you not doing the things that we keep telling you that you need to do? Try going into a First Nations reserve and doing that and see what happens. So why is this approach okay for drug users? Let's talk first a bit about how medical paradigms have influenced ethnographic studies of drug users and why it hasn't gone the other way around nearly as much as it should. Anthropologists have contributed a lot to attempts to humanize alcoholics and drug users in the public eye. A whole bunch of drug ethnographies in the 60s and 70s were the precursors to Philippe Bourgeois' groundbreaking fieldwork with heroin addicts in San Francisco in the late 80s and 90s, and more recent work on meth epidemics in the US. From the beginning of this research, social scientists from all disciplines looked at drug use epidemiologically. Ethnographers monitored drug-using behaviors as though they were contagious diseases. This approach actually proved pretty useful in the late 80s when injection drug use was found to be associated with the transmission of HIV, as we're all aware. Ethnographers, activists, and outreach workers tapped into knowledge about networks of illicit drug users in order to communicate evidence-based prevention strategies, such as needle sterilization, that later became known as harm reduction. So what is harm reduction? It's a set of practical strategies and ideas aimed at reducing the negative consequences associated with drug use. Things like giving heroin users the materials to inject safely, and in terms of my research, encouraging MDMA users to take rest breaks and drink lots of electrolyte-infused water to minimize the risk of heat stroke. Harm reduction is also a movement for social justice based on a belief in and a respect for the rights of individuals and those who use drugs, whether recreationally or due to addiction, or both. All aspects of harm reduction arose in response to the failure of morality-based and abstinence-only models. Think just say no. Thank you very much, Nancy Reagan. Since studies have shown that, just as with sexual education, these policies end up somewhere between useless and actively damaging when they're not paired with practical advice on what to do if you do end up saying yes. Not to mention the wholesale damage to marginalized populations in Canada and everywhere caused by framing drug abuse as a criminal rather than a health issue, creating zero-tolerance laws which are then enforced incredibly unequally, just like most laws, with further burden being placed on the poor. But that's neither here nor there. Water break. Anyways, by the 1990s, harm reduction, though contentious, became the dominant paradigm in which ethnographic research on understudied populations of drug users was conducted. As public uptake of this model has been hard won by health researchers, and there's still a really long road ahead, the consequence of this struggle has been reluctance on the part of medical anthropologists to uncritically accept the epidemiological model on which most of these drug studies are based. Nancy Campbell and Susan Shaw have suggested that state-funded ethnographic research today functions more like public health intervention into the lives of drug users than as a source of new community-based knowledge. In fact, they argue that the exclusive incitement to harm reduction could actually impede the potential exchange of information that may run contrary to the dominant paradigm. The continued use of individualistic approaches and definitions employed by public health and epidemiological models, or what Hunt and Barker call received categories, such as the conceptual split between legal substances like alcohol and illegal drugs, may hinder more insightful analysis by allowing dominant societal and state views about mood-altering substances to determine research directions. The lack of ethnographic research on such a pervasive issue as prescription drug abuse is a perfect example of this dichotomy. In uncritically accepting the prevailing problem-oriented definitions of concepts like legitimacy, addiction, and harm, medical anthropologists have neglected to fill a significant gap in drug use research, which attempts to form a holistic understanding of users' lives and acknowledge the agency of users themselves. This gap is particularly noticeable when looking at the research, or lack thereof, on drugs which are widely used but neither physiologically addictive nor involved in disease epidemiology, such as MDMA or marijuana. Ethnography has had a positive influence on the way public health research is conducted, but there's been a sort of boomerang effect on the way that drug ethnography has been influenced in turn. So what good is the ethnographic method if we're just doing it the same way as the others who copied it from us in the first place? It's like a Swami going to hot yoga class in Canada. So, 3 specific categories that I would like to confront. Illegal versus socially illegitimate practices, abuse and addiction, and harm. So who or what defines these terms? It's critical to engage with user and community understandings of these concepts and understand how their applications in research have been internalized, or not, by both anthropologists and users themselves, and the consequences thereof. This is important regardless of whether we want to solve a perceived problem or understand users on their own terms. The state has the authority to define what things or practices are legal and what falls within the realm of the illegal, that is, what activities or goods are prohibited or criminalized. Though this official boundary between the lawful and the outlawed makes a big impact on people's everyday lives, it regulates their behavior and punishes those who violate those established rules, it doesn't necessarily correspond to the way people distinguish acceptable and justified acts from what they consider to be wrong. Drug users are by definition already lawbreakers. So they represent a population which inherently has a non-overlapping understanding of what is legal and what is legitimate. They inhabit a particular moral world with a specific set of ethics. Moreover, the differences between what is legal and what is considered legitimate are pronounced and affect practices, even among non-users on the periphery, which is kind of interesting. For example, people are searched by security guards at the entrances to electronic music events, but as long as participants make somewhat of an effort to hide their drugs, generally only alcohol is confiscated, sometimes even if the drugs are found. So allowing public or state conceptions of legitimacy to influence us more, and by us I mean medical anthropologists, more than the conceptions of our participants has caused anthropologists to overlook things like prescription drugs, hallucinogens such as psychoactive mushrooms, which are widely used but only show up in studies of shamanistic practices, and power. There are loaded power relationships implicit in much of the discussion of acceptable versus unacceptable substances. Bourdieu says that research on any ingested substances necessitates the examination of the way in which elite groups and the state attempt to control fashion and good taste, thereby determining the acceptability of some ingested substances as opposed to others. How drug-using communities respond to, resist, or are controlled by those in power needs further examination. So it's frequently taken for granted that all drugs are problematic and all use is abuse. After all, we are the product of the moral environment that we grew up in, researchers and our biases included. But though they're all scheduled substances, ecstasy is not the same thing as meth, and LSD is not the same thing as PCP, and cocaine is not crack. There are huge differences, even though these are all equally illegal. So to exemplify this, I'm not going to read these or anything, but you can just sort of skim these and get an idea. These are narratives taken from studies with meth users. Not such a great thing. Obviously, everyone knows that meth sucks. compare those to user narratives from studies with MDMA. The third one is particularly my favorite one, because it's just kind of funny. Yeah. So these are both Schedule I substances in Canada. And this does not mean that all meth users, or all meth narratives are negative and all MDMA narratives are positive by any means. But I can tell you that the vast majority that I've come across so far tend to be this way. Yet with some notable exceptions, most researchers, myself included until I started to think about this stuff, continue to be all like, you know, okay, you love everyone and it changed your life forever, that's nice and all, but you were high so it doesn't count. Why don't you tell us some more about the bad stuff so that we can help you? Jeffrey Hunt has argued that by continually emphasizing the problems of drug use, we've ignored pleasure and fun, which are the main reasons recreational drug users cite, and which researchers keep making into a problem, as well as context and agency. He suggests that unlike much of the research on youthful drug use, which views young people as both passive recipients and inadequately formed adults, we adopted an approach that views young people as active players negotiating their lives within certain social, structural, and cultural constraints, just like everyone else. What a shocker. So, rather than categorizing all users as addicts or all drugs as problematic, it's potentially more helpful to strive to understand the drug user's conceptualization of addiction and how it relates to their perceived control of their personal drug use. This is also relevant when a drug is not considered addictive, yet still has a high potential for abuse under the right circumstances, which is the case of MDMA. In the absence of symptoms of physical addiction, the issue could still be explored through whether or not users feel that they have control over their habits and themselves. So what is harmful? And what is harm? Most studies look at harm as a result of the drug itself, but the externally imposed constraints on users of a drug are just as important to examine. To many drug users, the negative consequences of being arrested outweigh the negative effects caused by taking the actual drug. Many risks come from ignorance about and lack of access to factual information about the drug, or the unknown origins and composition of what they actually bought, both of which are due to said drugs being illegal, because Health Canada isn't making sure that drug dealers aren't misrepresenting their products. They just sell whatever will make them money. Probably because of where the funding for studies ultimately comes from, the public, the harm part of harm reduction seems to be defined from the outside in, prioritizing those harms that can leak out into normal society in the form of communicable disease. The primary goal of many harm reduction initiatives is to reduce the spread of viruses like HIV and hepatitis, but this is by far not the most pressing concern cited by intravenous drug users themselves, who have more immediate things like housing and food to worry about. This may be actually a sort of researcher harm reduction. If we can't affect the structural issues at the heart of these drug epidemics, then we can at least treat the symptoms. But even when harm is defined broadly, it's still primarily health focused and assumes that people are actually ingesting the drugs that they think they are, which is a really key component nowadays. Because meanwhile, the potential damage that comes from taking misrepresented substances are the #1 concern of many drug users right now, thanks to an explosion of unregulated research chemicals being sold as traditional drugs. You can take all the precautions in the world, but if you end up snorting ketamine instead of cocaine because your dealer doesn't care and gets a better margin that way, all hell can break loose. And it was also pointed out to me that some people here might not know the difference and might not really get what that means. So basically, if you think you're snorting cocaine, you're expecting to get a bit of an energy buzz. And if you end up getting dissociative hallucinations for 2 straight hours, you're gonna have a bad time. So different preparations are needed to reduce the harm from different drugs, especially when psychological and emotional issues are at stake. But if you don't know what you're taking, how can you tailor your harm reduction techniques? So I think we'd all agree that there are way too few anthropologists in the world today. So we're all on the same page there. So it's not surprising that there's not, in my opinion, and the opinion of others who are doing the same kind of research as me, there's not enough working with drug users. I'm sure we all feel that about our same emphases. But Those few anthropologists who are working with drug users are still letting public health and epidemiology call the shots. Maybe we're letting them take the lead because we continue to feel ambivalent about drug users as legitimate populations for study. Street addicts are fair game, sure, but only because they're vulnerable, and we love that. Hudson agrees, saying anthropologists hesitate to apply what is culturally nearest to them, the same respectful yet detached perspective that they habitually reserve for the culturally distant. But the relativism that we go out of our way to hammer into our understanding of reality should still include people like this, even if our instinct is to dismiss or label them. So, thank you. If you have any questions, write down the questions that you later.
Thanks, Hilary. So we will be having questions after all of these presentations. Next up we have Casey and Jennifer.